Today we are making an electric type Pikachu. I promise I'm not being redundant when I say that. That's right, today we are making a cyborg Pikachu. Not all mouse, not all machine. This is the sketch I made for this project. That's where the LED is gonna go, and that's all the information you need to know. So let's get started making an armature. For the armature, I'm double winding some wire and bending it into place to go in my sculpting block. Once it's about the right size and shape, I can pick out an LED to wrap around it, and this LED will eventually be Cyberchu's camera eye. We could also call him Pikaborg. Somehow that sounds like an Eastern European food dish, so I will be sticking with Cyberchu. Anyway, now that the LED is secured and I covered the whole thing in some aluminum foil, it's time to cover this bad boy in some clay. Once he looks like a pear, or for you more cultured folks, the Kiwi Elder from Skyward Sword, I add a bit more foil around the top of the LED and start adding clay to make his head. Now, I'm not exactly sure where things went wrong, but once I noticed that he looked like this, I knew that something had gone horribly wrong. I don't know why I am the way that I am, but the LED already being there was just screwing up my sculpting mojo, so I yanked it out really quick and then continued sculpting the rest of his body. Pikachu has a relatively simple figure, so I really only had to use my hands in the beginning to shape him, and then I would use my X-Acto knife to cut away any excess clay. With a semi-Pikachu looking figure, I could roll out a log of clay and cut it up to give him some arms. You know what they say. They say a magician never reveals his secrets, right? Well, I'm not a magician. So I'm gonna tell you a story. So all of the footage you're seeing right now is kind of old. I started making this project a while ago, but I put it down in a Walter White fugue state to make the Moo Moo Meadows cow and chicken jockey. So color me surprised when I picked it back up to see this. So, it would appear that leaving polymer clay to sit on XPS foam for a month, it might not be the best thing. Seems that Pikachu has made a crater in this XPS foam. Let's see if I can get it out. Gross. That does look sick as heck, but I'm gonna assume that that's toxic, gross goo. So who would have guessed that you could evolve Pikachu into muck by leaving it on a bookshelf for a month? You've heard of stones, you've heard of friendship, but you haven't heard of the bookshelf. Anyway, yeah, the foam was a goner. I had to throw that out, but Pikachu could be salvaged. First, I just had to remove the sludge from his back and patch it up with some fresh clay. Once he was no longer categorized as hazardous material, I could start working on his ears, and this is where the cyborg part of this craft starts kicking in. One of the first ideas I had for this craft was this one ear being connected through a bare metal wire and some LED cables later on. We'll add those later, don't worry. For now, we're just focusing on the major features. So once I get the ears done, it's time for the eyes. And I add the first, second, third, and fourth and fifth, and however many more off camera. For his cheeks, I'm using a bigger marker to mark where those are gonna go. We'll smooth it out later, I promise. Before we do though, I wanna work on his eyes a little bit more. I'm gonna carve out these circles of clay I marked and use my drill to make a pathway for that LED that I yanked out earlier. Once I can pull it up through his body, I clean the camera eye up a bit and start working on the normal eye with some pre-baked clay balls. Once his normal eye is in, I'm gonna smooth out his cheeks and give his entire body a once-over in some acetone to smooth out any lumps or bumps. Once he's relatively smooth, we can start adding the next layer of detail, starting with the tips of his ears. I thought that having his quote-unquote normal ear be actually normal was a little too boring, so the black tip of this ear I'm detailing to look like metal panels. I split it in half with a line down the middle, and then I'm going to use the tip of this pipette to make little screw holes. For the other more cyborg ear, I felt like the bottom of it needed a kind of connection point for the wire that's supporting it, so we're gonna add some metal panels to the bottom of this ear. Once I blend in the panel that wraps around the bottom, I felt it was a bit too simple, so I add this little piece towards the top to add a bit more interest. Then I separate them and smooth them out. For the very bottom, I add a little strip of clay just to give it a smoother transition into the wire, and then since there's a connective part to the ear, I felt there also had to be a part screwed into the top of his head to keep everything secure. So I add a little sheet of clay at the bottom of the wire. Part of my idea for the ear was sculpting the bottom to look like it was a ball joint. That way Pikachu could still move his ear around even though it was basically a prosthetic. So I add a little clay ball at the bottom of the wire and wrap a line of clay around it to seal in the ball joint. I add some screw holes that will fill in later and a few detail lines to the bottom panel before carving out some holes for where I eventually want some colorful cables to go. Once I add a few more details to the ear, now we can start working on his cheeks, and my idea for his cheeks was to turn them into big screw heads. I wanted to keep his body natural and just transform his bigger features into metal cyborgy parts, but I'm relatively inexperienced in making alterations to Pokemon like this, so I can't say I've thought out every reason for my design choices. Like honestly, I just added these because I thought they looked cool and they fit with the theme. But if Cyberchu is real, I bet you could probably unscrew these at night and he'd have a little USB-C under there to charge. Anyway, I cut out a tiny clay triangle and attached that to give him a nose. Then I drew on his mouth and smoothed it out with some isopropyl alcohol. When I was designing him, I noticed that the front of his head was looking good, but the back of his head was feeling a bit empty, and I figured if you have a camera for one of your eyes, you're gonna need some kind of access point to recharge or repair it. So behind his camera eye, we're gonna be carving on a little access door in case he ever breaks it or needs a software update or something. After I gave him some super tiny hinges, it's time for his two back stripes, and for these I'm using a sheet of parchment paper as a little outline to carve around. Like I said earlier, I want to take his more prominent features and make little adjustments to make him part mouse, part machine, right? So those back stripes are going to be some metal panels and they are perfect for it, but before I add those details, I'm going to make his tail really quick so I can put it in the oven and have it cool down and ready for later. This is the craft YouTuber equivalent of when your mom asks you to take meat out of the freezer for dinner. Once I have the tail wire covered, I throw it into the oven to bake, and then it's back to the back. I'm gonna add a screw hole on each end of the panels and 2 extra holes for some tail cables later on. Alright, so now that we're on his lower half, it's time to work on his knees. Now, I don't often find myself in the business of designing cyber Pokemon, right? So I kind of struggled with this part. I knew I wanted to put something there, I just wasn't exactly sure what or how, so I settled on some knee braces that I unintentionally cut into Pokeballs. My original thought was the circles in the middle could be pressed down, I mean, hypothetically, right? And it would pop out with a can of gas or air that would somehow assist Pikachu in his quick attacks, maybe giving him some extra propulsion. So the only things I was 100% sure I wanted to add was that, the circle in the middle, and also some cables entering the knee braces from the rest of his body. Once I pressed the cable holes, I kind of just freestyled some lines to add a little bit more interest, and this is when I realized I just made a Pokeball. I felt like the guy who was writing a song that started to sound really good in little increments, and then he played it all out and he realized he just rewrote the theme song of The Office. That's how that felt. Anyway, if they're good enough for the Pokemon Company, they're good enough for me. So now I can give Pikachu some fingers, and once those are on and blended in, I'm gonna send him to bake for the first time and save all of our progress. Once he's out and cool, I'm gonna give him a really good sand to get that Pokemon sculpture smoothness. After wiping off all the clay dust, I put the LED back in and secured the bottom so that the wires can wrap around the armature wire once again. Now that the outside of his eye is baked, I can secure the LED in the middle of it by packing all the empty space around it with clay. Once the LED is securely in the middle, I smooth out the clay around it with my metal sculpting tools, and then I use the same marker from earlier to add a little indent around the LED. Then I was looking at some pictures of cameras and I realized that the outside of them usually have this little like lined, bumpy pattern grip texture on them. So I tried to emulate that with this strip of clay that I textured. Once that's in, I add a little noodle of clay around the inside edge, and this is gonna mark where I want the resin we'll be adding to this eye later to end. Alright, next we're gonna drill a hole on his rump to give us a place to secure the tail to, and once I like the position of the tail, I'm gonna sculpt on the rest of it so it blends in seamlessly. Now I wanted there to be some cables connecting the tail to one of his back panels, so I'm going to add this little pad of clay with 2 cable entry points. Then I'm gonna add some balls of clay that'll be our screws for said back panels. Now, a few years ago, I built my PC and I had to get this little screwdriver set, if I could open it, there we go, to put it all together. And I thought it would be a cool small detail if I used one of these screw heads to make these screw types on the back panels a little different than the other ones. I feel like most machines always have a bunch of different kinds of screws on them, let alone a cyborg mouse that probably had these adjustments made at different times from different sources. I add a couple more nuts and bolts, and then I give him some tiny mouse feet to wrap around and hide the armature and wire. I bake and sand him one last time before giving him a very satisfying wipe down with some isopropyl alcohol to remove all that dust. And now it's time to paint him, and I color matched my little reference photo the best I could. We're using some satin yellow paint that I mixed up. I went for a satin finish, one because I wanted to highlight his smoothness, and two because the OG of Pokemon sculptures north of the border, he always seems to finish his own Pokemon creations in satin finishes, so now because I've watched every video obsessively several times, the two concepts are forever connected in my head. I'm gonna give him a few layers of the yellow in very thin coats until it's nice and opaque. And once he has a nice even skin tone, I paint the tips of his ears a satin black. We'll add more detail later, don't worry, but while I have it out, I'm gonna give his normal eye a base coat of the same color. Then I'm gonna mix in a little white and paint the camera eye a dark gray. Now, of course, we'll be adding resin over top his eyes later, but before then, I noticed that in a lot of the official HD Pikachu renders, he kind of has a reddish-brown sheen to his eyes, so I'm going to paint on a little bit of that so it isn't just a plain black. Then I'm going to detail his camera eye with some lighter grays to bring out the ridges and make it feel like it has some more depth. I add some super tiny highlight lines to the outside and clean up whatever paint that I accidentally got on the LED with some isopropyl alcohol. I give his nose a coat of a dark brownish black, and I add an orange wash to his mouth to make it stand out just a little bit more. Now for his cheeks, I'm going to be using a glossy red. I don't often use gloss paint, so it was kind of nice to break one out for once. Since I want these to look a little bit used, like they've been screwed on and off a couple times, I'm going to brush on a few dashes of silver here and there to make it look like the paint is kind of chipping off. Next up is painting all of the metal parts that are attached to his normal body, and for these, hear me out, okay? This was my vision. Alright, so you know when a car gets repainted, but they don't have the exact color from the manufacturer, so they try to blend it in the best they can, but it still looks a little bit different, so you know that it's a repair and it's not part of the original car. That was the vision. Like, Pikachu would ask them to blend in these metal parts so that people would have a harder time telling that he's gotten work done, right? One of my wonderful patrons pointed out that it's a little hard to see the difference, and I think he's 100% right. Looking back, I think I should have added a little more contrast. Since his body is already a little bit shiny, it does kind of blend in. But hey, we live and we learn. Now besides that, for the exposed wire on his ears, I wiped and scraped off all the excess yellow paint since I wanted it to just be silver. And speaking of silver, I went around to all the screws and dabbed on a bit of the same paint. I also added the orange wash that I used for his mouth into the recesses of the metal panels to add a little bit more contrast. Again, it didn't really do anything, but I think that at this point my corneas were blinded by the Pikachu yellow, so I did the same thing just in red for his screw cheeks, and those ended up pretty good. And finally, I dry brushed on some silver for all of his metal parts. Now it is time to work on the base, and today we're going in a slightly different direction than I usually do. I carve out space for his battery pack and the armature wire. Could I take all of this off? Yes. Will I? No. will.i.am. That's a music artist. Then I'm gonna start freeballing the design of the base with some dollar store foam board. Now, since this isn't based off of anything, my original base design was a little more theoretical than concrete, so I thought, let's actually add some concrete to this in the form of walls, and that would make the square shape of the base a little less boring. I feel like I would encounter this Pikachu in some dingy, realistic sewer. Don't ask me why, that's just the vibe I was feeling. Now for the area inside these concrete walls, I'm gonna make a grid for the floor. I'm thinking some rusty metal paneled flooring will do the trick, so I indented some lines to get me started. I also indent a little circle where I want to add a manhole cover later. Then I felt like the area where Pikachu stands should be a little bit elevated with a metal panel so it isn't so boring. I don't have anything that could add this kind of texture, which is what I was originally thinking. The closest thing I have is this sculpting tool, so I indent that into some foam and glue it down to the base. This section is going to be kind of squirrel brain, okay? This is when I said to myself, oh, I could definitely use some rivets all over the base, so I start rummaging through my cabinet and I found this tiny pack of nails that I'm going to start sticking into the foam. Now, while I was in the cabinet peacefully looking for these, I was ambushed by a toy fire truck that I disassembled for another craft. This thing was waiting for me in the trenches. It used guerrilla warfare tactics to guilt me, and it worked. I cannot let this thing rot in my cabinet forever, so today we are going to use as much of it as I can for this base. That way I can actually sleep tonight. I didn't do this on purpose because I was like, oh, it's gonna make a loud noise, isn't it? But after I let it sing for the first and last time, I start to unscrew the bottom of the fire truck. I also realized that I could use these screws on the big metal grate that Pikachu is going to be standing on, and then I continued disassembling it. Once I got the bottom open and got a good look at the innards of this fire truck, I realized I could use these as well. I will save these little batteries. I'm sure one day I'll need them. Until then, I can use the button too now. Ha ha ha. Alright, I'm just gonna... Sorry to anyone who likes electronics. This could be a cool, like, manhole cover. So I went back to that circle that I indented a while ago and cut out enough space to glue in the speaker to act as the sewer cover that I wanted. I also realized the base was a little too short to make it look natural, so I added another metal grate over top that would add a little height to this area. But after I glued down the grate, I realized that it was a little too boring, so I took out the battery cover inside the fire truck and the screw that secured it, and I glued it down in the middle. I just glued it upside down to get a little extra panel action. I glued in some more screws onto Pikachu's platform and glued on the mini PCB to the back wall. The wires connected to it looked cool, so of course I stuck those into the wall as well, and I added that little button that I loved right next to those two side wires. I used these two metal pieces that were on the inside of the truck as a small detail on the outside concrete wall since they were feeling a bit bland. Then I glued down the red plastic button cap on one of the other walls. In my original base design, I thought it would be cool to have a little sewer carved in, and I still wanted to include that, so I carved a deep rectangle into the XPS foam, cut off these little things at the top of the truck that I thought looked like pipes, and glued them down. Inside the truck, there were also these little plastic support tubes, so I used those as another smaller pipe next to the first one. Then I took that broken panel and glued it to the inside of one of the concrete walls that was looking a bit barren. Then I just kept adding details where I felt the base needed them until I had used enough of the fire truck and spiritually could let it go with no regrets. With all of those small details on, it's time to even everything out with a coat of black paint. Once the black paint was on and dry, I give the whole thing a coat of dark gray paint starting with the concrete walls. Now I'm gonna leave the floor that dark gray, but to give the concrete some contrast, I'm painting it in a much lighter gray. I also thought that I might mimic the cool color variations in concrete if I just don't mix the lighter gray paint entirely and dip top it on. So that's what we're trying out today. Once I painted the walls and cleaned up the edges of the floor that I cut light gray paint on, I add some rusty reddish brown to Pikachu's platform and the manhole cover. With part of the fire truck ladder, which I painted to match, I glue that above the pipes we added and cleaned it up with some paint and thin foam strips on each end. Using isopropyl alcohol and a Q-tip, I take off some of the paint for the colorful wires attached to that PCB on the back wall, and give the floor and concrete walls their own respective paint washes. When those dry, I funnel Pikachu and his wires through the floor and solder them to the battery pack. Alright, now it's time for the finishing details on Pikachu, and I cut off some cables from some extra LEDs I had to start. I feel like no cyborg Pokemon would be complete without some exposed cables, so using some super glue, I'm gonna secure as many as I can fit into all of the holes that we made when we were sculpting him. That was a really good music transition anyway. Before we add his tail wires, I'm gonna add some resin to the back stripes, as well as the cable connector on his tail. After the tail cables are glued in, I use some resin on the metal ear tip, as well as finally adding resin to both eyes. Alright everyone, with that, I think I know exactly what you're about to say to me. Diana, we want to take a peek at the craft. Okay, that was bad. And as always, we have to give a big shout out to all of my patrons, but especially my new DIYers, Pebble the Bear, Jordan Nelson, and Parker Osman, and my newest artificer, Gerbear. Also a special shout out to my first ever patron who is still with me like 2.5 or 3 years later. Abe, you are the GOAT. Not only are these folks helping me continue to make videos, but they're also over there deciding the next craft. So if you enjoyed the video, consider supporting me over on Patreon. Well, thanks for sticking all the way to the end on this one. This one was quite fun. For the next one, I think I'll be doing something to honor my channel name, so let's see if any of you can guess what I'm gonna make. Hope all of you have a great week, and I will see you next time.